Everyone laughed when the man inherited a useless swamp, but his dog made an incredible discovery that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. Jack Milton's life had long ago lost the sharp edges of excitement and adventure that once defined his younger years. Time and disappointment had worn him down into a man of quiet survival, a figure who kept moving forward out of necessity rather than hope. He lived on the outskirts of a small town where the houses sagged against the weight of years, and the people measured each other not by kindness, but by what they could afford to flaunt. Jack had nothing left to flaunt. The divorce had taken the home, the debts had claimed the savings, and his pride had eroded slowly under the steady trickle of humiliations, unpaid bills, job rejections, the constant pressure of living hand to mouth. What remained to him was a rented trailer at the edge of a gravel road, a battered pickup that coughed more than it ran, and a golden retriever named Sam, who had more light in his eyes than Jack had seen in his own for decades. Sam had entered his life in the quiet way that real blessings often do, without fanfare and without expectation. Jack had found him in the corner of a rescue shelter, ribs visible beneath patchy fur, tail thumping in slow rhythm as if he didn't quite believe in his own happiness. Something in that dog's gaze had pierced through the fog of Jack's despair, and before he realized it, he was filling out adoption papers. In the years since, Sam had become the truest companion Jack had ever known. He met his master at the door each evening with the same boundless enthusiasm, whether Jack carried home a bag of groceries or nothing at all. He listened to complaints that never reached human ears, and he rested his head on Jack's knee during nights when silence pressed in too heavily. Sam's loyalty was pure, without condition, and in a life that had become a maze of conditions, that purity was worth more than gold. It was on a Tuesday morning, gray and drizzling, that the letter arrived. Jack almost missed it among the stack of bills and advertisements, but the heavy paper and embossed seal caught his eye. He tore it open expecting more bad news, perhaps another reminder of what little he owned, and found instead a lawyer's formal phrasing about an inheritance. A distant relative, some great uncle whose name rang only faint bells of childhood stories, had passed away and left him a parcel of land. For the briefest flicker of a moment, Jack allowed himself a wild thought. Land meant value. Land meant a fresh start, maybe a chance to escape the slow drowning of his current life. But as his eyes traced the details, his shoulders sagged again. The parcel was not a farm or forest, not a cabin or meadow. It was a swamp, a stretch of bog and marshland that locals called useless, a place most had long forgotten. When he told a few acquaintances in town, they laughed. One slapped him on the back and congratulated him on becoming the proud owner of Mosquito Country. Another suggested he should start charging admission for people who liked the smell of rot. Jack smiled weakly, the way a man does when he knows there's no use arguing. But their laughter stung. It reminded him of every failed venture, every moment when life seemed to mock his efforts. That night he sat at his small kitchen table staring at the deed, the paper damp from the condensation of his coffee mug. He told himself it was nothing, just another burden. Yet something in him, a stubborn spark that hadn't completely died, whispered that he ought to at least see it. If nothing else, a trip to the swamp might break the monotony. The following Saturday, he loaded Sam into the truck and set out. The drive carried them past tired farmhouses and into landscapes more wild and neglected. The road narrowed, trees pressed closer, and soon he found himself on dirt tracks where grass grew through cracks and potholes lurked beneath puddles. Sam pressed his nose to the window, tail wagging with interest. To the dog, this was no chore but an adventure, a chance to discover new scents and paths. Jack envied him that eagerness. For Jack, each mile felt heavier, dragging him toward a place he didn't want, but somehow needed to face. When he reached the edge of the property, disappointment hit him like a damp fog. The swamp stretched out in flat, gray monotony, reeds whispering in the breeze, water stagnant and green with algae. Mosquitoes hovered in thick clouds, and the air smelled of decay, as if the earth itself had given up. Old fence posts leaned drunkenly at the boundary line, half sunk into mud. It looked like a place abandoned, not just by people but by hope. Jack leaned against the truck door, staring at the deed again, as though the words might transform into something else. But the reality remained stubborn before him. He had inherited not land, but a burden. Sam, however, leapt from the truck with joyous energy, splashing into the shallow edges of the marsh, barking at the chorus of frogs. He bounded from hummock to hummock, nose to the ground, tail slicing the air. Jack couldn't help but smile despite himself. To Sam, the swamp was not ruin. It was life, a world full of mysteries and hidden trails. Watching the dog, Jack felt a strange tug deep inside, as though the swamp were not mocking him, but daring him. He was too tired to consider what that meant, but he didn't call the dog back. He let Sam explore while he lit a cigarette and stared into the mist. That evening, when they returned home, Jack carried with him the smell of mud and the weight of futility. Yet beneath that weight lay something quieter. The swamp was worthless, yes, but it was his. For a man who had lost nearly everything, even a swamp was a kind of anchor. He had not chosen it, but perhaps it had chosen him. Sam slept at his feet, paws twitching as if chasing dreams. And Jack wondered what the dog saw in that place that he could not. He told himself it was nothing more than an animal's joy in mud and water, but part of him wasn't convinced. The following week was a blur of work shifts and bills, but the swamp pulled at the edge of his thoughts. He caught himself glancing at maps, tracing the outline of the land, remembering the way the mist curled above the reeds. Sam seemed restless, scratching at the door as though urging him to return. Finally, on another gray morning, Jack loaded the dog into the truck again. He told himself it was just to let Sam run, just to stretch his legs. But he knew there was more to it. Something about that place lingered, whispering that not all was as it seemed. As he parked once more by the sagging fence line and stepped out onto the damp ground, Jack realized he had crossed an unseen threshold. The swamp was no longer just an inheritance on paper. It was a challenge, a mystery, a mirror of his own battered life. It looked ruined, forgotten, mocked by others, but perhaps, hidden deep beneath the mud, it held something waiting to be uncovered. He had no idea then how literal that thought would become, nor how much his faithful dog would have to do with the truth. But as Sam bounded ahead into the mist with a bark that echoed like a call to adventure, Jack followed, not knowing that the swamp would soon reshape both their fates. The second visit to the swamp came as naturally as breathing, though Jack would have denied it if anyone had asked. He told himself he was only returning because Sam needed the exercise, because a dog deserved more than the same tired roads of town. Yet as the truck rattled along the narrowing dirt track, he knew there was another reason pressing him forward. The swamp had taken root in his thoughts during the week. In quiet moments at work, when his hands repeated the same mechanical motions of lifting and stacking, he found himself picturing the curtain of mist that hung over the reeds, the strange stillness of the water, the silence that seemed thicker than silence elsewhere. It was not beauty, not in any traditional sense, but it carried a weight that was difficult to ignore, as though the land itself waited to be acknowledged. The morning was pale, the sky a sheet of dull silver without sun or shadow. When Jack pulled up to the boundary fence, the tires sank slightly into mud that had not been there on his last visit. Rain had fallen in the night, and the bog responded by swelling, reclaiming even the edges of the track. He stepped out cautiously, boots squelching in muck, the damp seeping cold through worn leather. Sam leapt down with unrestrained joy, his golden coat quickly streaked with brown, his nose already working furiously as if the entire marsh were a letter written only for him. Jack's first instinct was to scowl at the mess, but something stopped him. Watching Sam plunge through reeds, sending flocks of birds into the air, he realized the dog was reading the swamp differently than he was. To Jack it was decay and stagnation. To Sam it was mystery and abundance. The retriever dashed through puddles with the confidence of an animal born to water, pausing only to glance back as though urging his master to follow. Jack did not. He stood at the margin, arms crossed, staring at the mire that stretched endlessly ahead. The longer he gazed, the heavier the sensation became that this place was more than surface appearances. The swamp was not silent. Beneath the croak of frogs and the drone of insects lay other sounds. The soft gulp of mud releasing bubbles, the rustle of reeds in a breath of wind, the occasional splash of something unseen beneath the water. It seemed alive in a way that unsettled him, not hostile, but watchful. Jack lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl into the damp air, trying to impose some order on the scene. He thought of his relatives, the ones who had owned this land before him, and wondered why any man would cling to a property like this when he could have sold it for even the smallest sum. Perhaps they had not been able to sell. Perhaps no one had wanted it. Perhaps they had known something about it that others did not. Sam's barking interrupted his thoughts. The dog had discovered a half-rotten log and was pawing at it, sending sprays of mud flying. Jack shook his head and slogged toward him, muttering under his breath. But when he reached the spot, he paused. The log was hollow, and within it grew a fungus that glowed faintly, a pale sheen that seemed almost unnatural in daylight. He crouched and touched the wood, finding it spongy and damp, the fungus slick under his fingers. A shiver ran down his spine. He told himself it was nothing more than nature's oddity. Yet the feeling lingered that the swamp was presenting him with small signs, invitations to look deeper. He and Sam spent the rest of the morning wandering the edges. Jack never dared too far into the bog, afraid of hidden sinkholes and treacherous ground. But even from the perimeter, he saw remnants of forgotten things. An old fence half buried in cattails, a rusted barrel whose paint had long since surrendered to corrosion, shards of glass that winked from the mud before sinking again. Every discovery hinted at the presence of people, at lives intersecting with the swamp and then vanishing, leaving only scraps behind. He wondered who they were and why they had come. The land did not look like a place for settlement. It looked like a place people stumbled upon and then abandoned, a stage for unfinished stories. By midday, Jack was exhausted, his legs heavy from slogging through mud, his clothes damp with sweat and mist. He sat on a stump near the edge of the water, lighting another cigarette, watching Sam swim back and forth after sticks. The dog's energy was endless, his joy unshaken by the gloom that pressed against his master. Jack found himself thinking again of his own life, of how he had been treated since inheriting the bog. People's laughter echoed in his memory. Yet here, in this forgotten place, their laughter seemed distant and irrelevant. The swamp didn't mock him. It simply existed, patient and timeless. Perhaps that was what unsettled him most. The rest of the world demanded and judged, but the swamp only waited. The day ended, with clouds thickening into rain. As the first drops pattered on the surface of the bog, Jack called for Sam, who bounded up happily, shaking water everywhere. They returned to the truck, the dog's fur smelling of earth and brine, Jack's boots caked with filth. Driving back, windshield wipers squealing against glass, Jack felt the same futility as before. Yet beneath it was a thread of something else, something he could not name. It was not hope, not yet, but it was enough to keep him from dismissing the swamp entirely. That night he dreamed of the bog. He saw it under moonlight, silver mist rising like smoke, and heard Sam barking somewhere deep within, his voice echoing as though calling from a cavern. Jack woke with his heart racing, sweat on his brow. The image of the glowing fungus burned into his mind. He sat in the dark trailer for a long time, listening to Sam's steady breathing on the floor beside the bed, and knew he would return again. The swamp was no longer merely a piece of unwanted inheritance. It had become a presence in his life, drawing him in with whispers of something hidden. He did not yet know that the whispers were real, that the land held more than decay, but he felt it deep in his bones, the way a man senses a storm before the first cloud appears. When dawn broke, Jack was already planning. He would bring better boots, maybe a spade, something to mark paths so he did not get lost. He told himself it was practical preparation for a man exploring his own property, but he could not shake the image of Sam barking at the log, paws digging furiously, as though the dog had been trying to reveal something buried. The swamp had secrets. Sam seemed to know it, and now reluctantly, Jack began to suspect it too. The following days blurred into one another as Jack went through the routines of his tired life. But the swamp refused to leave his thoughts. It lingered in the background of every moment, seeping into his mind like damp into wood. He caught himself replaying the memory of Sam barking furiously at the hollow log, the sight of that faint phosphorescence glowing from within. He remembered the strange quiet that hung over the water when the mist thickened, and how, despite his exhaustion and frustration, he had felt something stir within him, something that was not despair but a curious kind of anticipation. It was absurd, he told himself. A man of his age and circumstances had no business chasing after mysteries in mud and stagnant pools. And yet each evening, when Sam pressed his head against Jack's knee, tail wagging as though asking when they would return, the answer became more certain. They would go back. The morning he chose was cool and brittle with the promise of autumn. Jack dressed in heavier boots this time and carried an old spade from the shed, feeling faintly ridiculous but unable to ignore the compulsion to bring it. Sam was practically vibrating with energy as they set out, as though he already knew the day would bring more than a simple walk. When they arrived at the bog, the mist lay thick and low, drifting across the ground in pale ribbons. Jack inhaled deeply, the air damp and heavy with the scent of peat, decay, and waterlogged earth. There was no beauty in it by ordinary standards, yet something in that scent struck him as ancient and solemn, as though he were standing on the threshold of a secret long kept. Sam darted ahead, nose to the ground, weaving through reeds and shallow water with the single-minded determination of a creature on the trail of something important. Jack followed more cautiously, wary of hidden patches of sinking mud, until the dog stopped abruptly near the old stump they had passed before. Sam barked, dug at the earth with his paws, then looked back at Jack as though commanding him to take over. Jack sighed, tightened his grip on the spade, and began to dig. The soil was stubborn, waterlogged and clinging, but beneath the layers of mud and tangled roots, something hard resisted the blade. Jack's pulse quickened. He scraped more carefully, sweat trickling despite the chill, until the outline of a corner revealed itself. Wood dark and sodden, bound with rusted metal. His first thought was that it was nothing more than trash, an old crate left to rot. But as he dug further, the size and solidity of it became clear. This was no mere box discarded by chance. It had weight, intention. Sam barked wildly, circling as though he too understood the importance of the discovery. Jack pried at the soil, heart pounding, until at last the earth surrendered more of its secret. What he uncovered was the top of a chest, its surface softened by decades of burial, yet unmistakably crafted to endure. The spade struck metal again, a sound that rang strangely in the stillness. Jack froze, breath caught in his throat. For a long moment he simply stared at the half-buried chest, his mind reeling with disbelief. Every instinct warred within him. Logic told him it was junk, worthless remnants of some bygone homestead or hunter's cache. But something deeper whispered that it was more. He touched the damp wood, feeling the texture beneath his fingers, the way the earth seemed reluctant to release it. His pulse hammered louder than the drumming of blood in his ears. The bog was not mocking him after all. It was offering. He worked feverishly, ignoring the ache in his arms and the mud that clung to his clothes. Sam dug beside him, sending clumps of wet soil flying. Together they unearthed enough to glimpse the chest's full lid. It was bound with rusted iron straps, a heavy lock corroded into uselessness. With trembling hands, Jack found a stick sturdy enough to wedge beneath the edge and pried until the swollen wood gave way with a groan that sounded like the swamp exhaling after holding its breath for decades. The lid creaked open, releasing a stale scent of earth and metal. Inside, the gloom concealed shapes that gleamed faintly beneath the mud-caked shadows. Jack's eyes widened. Coins, their edges dulled but unmistakably gold, scattered across the bottom. A tangle of jewelry, chains, and rings glimmered faintly in the dim light, and among them packets of papers bound in oilcloth, the writing faded but still visible on the surface. For a long time Jack could only stare, mouth dry, mind unable to process what lay before him. The swamp that had been dismissed as worthless, a joke among neighbors, was revealing a fortune. His first coherent thought was absurdly practical. This could solve everything. The debts, the unpaid bills, the gnawing fear of the future. He imagined the faces of those who had laughed at him, imagined the silence that would follow when they realized what the cursed bog had hidden. Yet the thrill of discovery was quickly shadowed by unease. Why was it here? Who had left it? He touched the oilcloth packets and realized with a chill that they were old, perhaps more than a century. He imagined settlers, perhaps fleeing conflict or disaster, bearing their wealth to retrieve it later, only never to return. He imagined thieves hiding plunder. Whatever the story, the swamp had kept it buried for generations, and now it had chosen him to uncover it. Sam nosed at the chest, tail wagging furiously, as though urging Jack to celebrate. Jack smiled faintly and stroked the dog's head, but his thoughts were tangled. This was no simple gift. Wealth unearthed in such a place carried shadows with it, stories unfinished. He closed the chest again, the weight of the lid pressing down like a secret not yet ready to be told. By the time they left the swamp, the light was fading. Jack trudged back to the truck with mud-caked boots and trembling hands, the image of gold and old paper burned into his vision. Sam trotted happily beside him, his fur plastered with muck, unaware of the storm gathering in his master's mind. Jack loaded the dog into the cab, climbed in after him, and sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. His life had shifted in the span of a single day. The swamp was no longer just a mirror of his despair. It was a portal into something larger, something dangerous and alluring. As he drove away, the mist closed behind him, veiling the place as though to protect its secret once more. Yet Jack knew the veil had been lifted for him, and him alone. He did not yet know what to do with the discovery, nor what dangers it might invite. But one truth had settled firmly in his chest. The cursed bog was no curse at all. It was a trail, and he had just set his first foot upon it. The night after uncovering the chest passed without rest. Jack lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the images of what he had seen repeated endlessly in his mind. The gleam of dulled gold coins, the curve of a chain that must have once belonged to a lady of wealth, the faded lettering on oilcloth-wrapped documents, all haunted him as if he had opened not merely a chest, but a door into another life. He drifted in and out of shallow dreams, each one twisted with visions of faceless men reaching for him through the swamp, their hands dripping with mud, their voices whispering claims to what he had found. Sam slept peacefully on the floor, his breathing steady and comforting, a reminder that some things in life remain simple and pure. But Jack's world had tilted, and even the faithful presence of the dog could not steady it completely. By morning he resolved to return, though his body still ached from the digging. He loaded the spade and a heavy tarp into the truck and whistled for Sam, who bounded into the passenger seat with eager enthusiasm, as though sensing that this day too would hold something extraordinary. The swamp was waiting, mist curling above the reeds like smoke from a smoldering fire. As Jack walked toward the half-buried chest, he felt a heaviness in the air, as if the land itself knew he was trespassing on secrets. He worked slowly, pulling the chest fully free of its earthy cradle. The wood was spongy in places, but the iron bands still held firm. He dragged it to higher ground, grunting with effort, Sam panting beside him, tail wagging as if proud of their prize. When he opened the lid again, the contents revealed themselves more clearly in the light. Coins of mixed origin, some bearing faces of monarchs Jack could not name, others stamped with symbols of trade, spilled across the bottom. Jewelry lay tangled together, a brooch shaped like a bird with missing gemstones, a necklace whose clasp had corroded, but whose chain still glimmered faintly. The documents, carefully wrapped, seemed to have been protected from the worst of the damp. Jack lifted one cautiously, peeling back the oilcloth to reveal parchment covered in elegant handwriting. Though the ink had faded, he could make out fragments of words references to land, to travel, to dates more than 100 years old. As he studied the contents, unease grew within him. This was no ordinary stash. It was wealth meant to be hidden with intention, preserved with care. Whoever had buried it must have planned to return. The swamp had swallowed those plans, but their ghosts lingered in every coin and scrap of paper. Jack felt like an intruder, a thief stumbling upon a legacy that was never meant for him. And yet, he could not deny the rush of possibility that coursed through him. This treasure could change his life, could erase debts, could lift him from the mire of survival into something resembling freedom. He pictured the trailer left behind, the empty refrigerator, the laughter of townsfolk who had mocked him. All of that could vanish with what he held in his hands. But shadows followed the vision of riches. He imagined those same townsfolk seeing him suddenly wealthy, whispering questions, suspicion sharpening their eyes. He knew gossip spread like fire in a dry field. Already someone might have noticed him returning to the swamp again and again. Already curiosity might be forming in the minds of those who had mocked his inheritance. The idea of others learning about the chest chilled him. Treasure had a way of drawing hunger from people, stripping away kindness and exposing greed. He closed the lid, heart pounding, and dragged the chest further inland, where he could better conceal it beneath brush and reeds. Sam followed closely, alert to his master's tension. The dog growled once at the wind, his ears pricking as though he sensed a presence that Jack could not see. Jack knelt, resting his hand on Sam's head, whispering reassurance more for himself than the animal. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man holding a secret too heavy for his shoulders. The following days confirmed his fears. At the small store in town, Jack noticed the way conversations paused when he entered. A neighbor asked, too casually, if he had been spending more time on that useless patch of land. Another joked about whether he had found buried pirate gold yet. Jack forced a laugh, but the skin on his neck prickled. News traveled faster than he had imagined. He wondered if someone had seen him hauling supplies in and out of the swamp, or if they simply guessed that anyone visiting such a place must be searching for something. That night, as he sat on the porch of the trailer, smoking in the dark, Sam stiffened suddenly, ears pricked, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Jack froze, straining to hear. A sound came from the gravel road, the crunch of a footstep, the pause of someone standing just out of sight. He rose, heart hammering, but by the time he reached the end of the porch, the night was empty. Only the faint rustle of trees and the distant call of an owl remained. Whoever it had been had melted away, leaving behind only the certainty that he was being watched. He could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the oilcloth-wrapped documents spread before him, reading what fragments he could under the yellow light. They spoke of journeys westward, of families seeking refuge, of valuables hidden for safekeeping. He pieced together a story of settlers fleeing persecution, or perhaps bandits, burying their wealth in a place so inhospitable no one would dare seek it. But someone must have known. Someone must have whispered through generations that a treasure slept beneath the bog, waiting for the right hands. And now those whispers had reached ears less scrupulous than his. Sam rested at his feet, the warmth of the dog's body steadying him. Jack realized then that the retriever was more than a companion. He was guardian, anchor, and conscience. Without Sam, he might have given in to panic, might have tried to sell the coins in secret and drawn immediate danger upon himself. With Sam, he felt a measure of clarity. The dog wanted nothing from the treasure, asked for nothing but loyalty. His simple faith reminded Jack of what mattered and of how easily greed could poison men. The days that followed deepened the conflict. Jack knew he could not keep the chest hidden forever. If he attempted to sell pieces of it quietly, questions would arise. If he reported it, officials would seize most of it under law, leaving him with only a fraction. And if he told no one, the burden of secrecy would grow heavier, the danger of discovery greater. He found himself caught between desperation for a better life and the knowledge that any misstep could destroy him. Each night he returned to the chest, opening it beneath cover of darkness, staring at the glimmering contents until his hands shook. He dreamed of escape, of freedom, of proving wrong those who had dismissed him as a failure. But each morning he woke with unease, aware that treasure unearthed from cursed ground carried with it more than wealth. It carried the weight of all who had sought it before, and the shadows of those who might seek it still. Sam never wavered. The dog patrolled the edges of the swamp with tireless energy, barking at unseen intruders, digging at patches of earth as if uncovering further secrets. Jack began to trust his instincts more than his own. When Sam stood still, ears pricked, Jack felt the hair rise on his own arms. The dog knew. The swamp was stirring, its secrets awakened, and the shadow of treasure was lengthening across both their lives. By the time autumn leaves began to fall, Jack understood that the chest was no simple windfall. It was a test. The swamp had given him a glimpse of fortune, but it demanded something in return. Caution, resilience, perhaps even sacrifice. As he stood at the water's edge one evening, the sky burning red with sunset and Sam splashing happily in the shallows, Jack realized his life could no longer remain the same. The treasure was not only gold and jewels. It was choice, and choice always came with a price. And in the distance, unseen among the trees beyond the bog, a figure watched, silent and patient, waiting for Jack to make his move. The unease that had been growing inside Jack since the discovery of the chest thickened into something tangible in the weeks that followed. What had once been a burden of secrecy began to feel more like a siege. He noticed it first in the way people looked at him when he came into town. Conversations paused, eyes lingered a fraction too long, and smiles carried an edge that was more curiosity than friendliness. At the gas station, a man he barely knew asked, half joking, if Jack had struck oil in the swamp, since he seemed to be making more trips out there. At the grocery store, an older woman leaned over her cart and whispered, "They say you've been digging. Be careful what you find out there." Jack forced a chuckle each time, but the tension in his chest never eased. Word had spread further than he imagined, and though no one said it outright, he knew they were all thinking the same thing: treasure. At night, the anxiety worsened. Sam's instincts sharpened as if he too sensed the invisible net tightening around them. The dog would prick his ears at sounds Jack could not hear, pacing the porch restlessly, growling at shadows beyond the tree line. Jack began to notice signs that confirmed his fears: cigarette butts discarded in the grass near the property edge, footprints in mud where no neighbor had reason to walk, branches bent in ways that suggested watchers had slipped silently through. The swamp, once merely heavy with its own secrets, now seemed to hold human menace as well. Jack lay awake listening for the crunch of footsteps outside, one hand resting on the spade that he kept by the door, the other lowering to stroke Sam's head when the dog pressed close. The first true test came on a cold, moonless night when the sound of metal scraping jolted Jack from half-sleep. Sam was already on his feet, barking fiercely, the sound shattering the quiet like glass. Jack leapt from bed, heart hammering, and grabbed the spade. He burst onto the porch to see shadowy figures near the shed, one fumbling with the padlock. The beam of a flashlight caught his eyes for a split second before vanishing. Sam tore across the yard, his body a streak of gold in the darkness, teeth bared and growl deep. The intruders cursed and scattered, their footsteps thrashing through reeds before vanishing into silence. Jack stood trembling in the night air, gripping the spade, every nerve alive with fear and fury. He knew then that secrecy was no longer enough. They knew. Someone had heard or seen enough to make the swamp worth the risk. The following morning he inspected the shed. The padlock had been scratched and twisted, but it had held. The chest remained hidden beneath layers of brush and tarp. Yet Jack's relief was hollow. The trespassers would return. Their failure tonight would only fuel determination. He spent the day fortifying what little he could, moving the chest deeper into the swamp, covering tracks, scattering reeds and mud to obscure where he had walked. Sam followed loyally, watching the tree line with suspicion, his bark echoing when the woods grew too still. By the time dusk fell, Jack was exhausted and filthy, but he felt no safer. He knew he could not fight shadows forever. Offers began to arrive in unexpected ways. A man approached him at the diner one afternoon, sliding into the booth uninvited, smiling with false warmth. He spoke of buying property, of interest in wetlands for conservation, and mentioned a sum of money that would have been unimaginable for Jack only months ago. His words dripped with persuasion, but his eyes were sharp, testing. Jack refused quickly, sensing the trap, but the man only smiled wider and said he would be back. Days later, a letter arrived in Jack's mailbox, unsigned, offering to relieve him of the burden for a figure written in bold numbers. Jack crumpled it in anger, but fear lingered in the back of his mind. If they were bold enough to make offers, they would be bold enough to take more. Sam became his truest defense during those uneasy days. The retriever never left his side, growling at strangers who lingered too close, barking in the night when whispers carried from the woods. Once, as Jack carried supplies back from town, Sam stopped dead on the path and refused to move forward, his gaze fixed on the brush. Jack followed his eyes and caught the faintest glint of sunlight on glass, as if someone were watching through binoculars. He turned and the shimmer vanished. But the message was clear. They were being observed. The dog's unerring instinct became Jack's compass. He trusted Sam's senses even when his own eyes saw nothing, because each time he ignored them, unease proved him right later. Fear turned inward too. Jack began to question his own resolve. He asked himself whether it had been worth it to disturb the swamp's secret, whether the gold was a blessing or a curse. Some nights he dreamed of taking a few coins, selling them quietly, and disappearing somewhere far away with Sam. Other nights he thought of walking into the sheriff's office with the chest and surrendering it, letting the law claim it as history. But whenever he leaned too far in either direction, he remembered the eyes of the men at his shed, the greed behind the offers, the whispers that spread like infection. If he surrendered it, the treasure might vanish into corrupt hands. If he fled with it, men would hunt him forever. The swamp had not only given him wealth, it had given him a burden heavier than anything he had carried before. One evening, after another day of restless vigilance, Jack sat on the porch staring at the darkening bog. Sam lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes glowing faintly in the light of the lantern. Jack spoke aloud, though his words were meant as much for himself as for the dog. "If I didn't have you, I'd have given up by now." Sam thumped his tail against the boards, lifting his head to rest it on Jack's knee. In that small gesture, Jack felt something vital, the reminder that not all treasure was measured in gold. The loyalty of the dog beside him, constant and unselfish, was worth more than coins that drew shadows closer each day. That realization steadied him. It did not solve his problems, but it gave him courage to face them. The trials continued. Twice more he caught men prowling near the swamp, once in daylight and once in misty twilight. Both times Sam's growls had alerted him before danger came too close. Both times the intruders fled when confronted, but their retreat was temporary, like wolves testing the edges of prey. Jack grew weary of the cat and mouse, the waiting for the next attempt. Yet he refused to abandon the swamp. Something in him, stubborn and fierce, had awakened. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps desperation, perhaps the faint hope that he could prove stronger than those who circled him. Whatever it was, he resolved that if the swamp had chosen him, he would not relinquish it easily. The night that sealed his resolve came when Sam again saved him from danger. Jack had fallen into uneasy sleep when the sound of breaking wood snapped him awake. The shed door had been forced, and a shadow bent over the chest's hiding place. Before Jack could even rise fully, Sam lunged, his bark exploding into the night, his body a golden blur. The intruder shouted in panic, stumbling back as Sam snapped at his sleeve, teeth tearing fabric. Jack rushed forward, spade in hand, and the figure fled, vanishing into the bog. In the silence afterward, Jack fell to his knees, pulling Sam close, whispering thanks with a voice that shook. Without the dog, the treasure would already be gone. Without the dog, he might already be dead. By dawn, as the swamp lay hushed beneath a veil of mist, Jack understood the truth of his trials. They were not only tests of vigilance against outsiders, but of his own heart. The swamp had given him gold, but Sam had given him clarity. Greed could consume him as easily as it consumed others, but loyalty and courage could preserve him. He resolved then to stand his ground, not for the coins alone, but for the principle that what was unearthed should not be surrendered to those who sought it through lies and violence. The trials were not over. Jack knew they would grow harder, the threats bolder, the temptations stronger. But as he stood with Sam beside him, watching the sun lift slowly over the cursed bog, he felt something he had not felt in years: determination. The man who had once lived in quiet defeat was being reshaped by struggle, hardened by it, transformed. The swamp had tested him, but he had not broken. And with Sam's faith guiding him, he believed, perhaps for the first time, that he would not break at all. The days that followed the last intrusion hung heavy with silence, the kind of silence that is never truly quiet, but filled with the weight of waiting. Jack moved through them with a restless vigilance, half expecting each moment to bring the return of footsteps in the night, the crash of breaking wood, the cold gleam of eyes watching from the mist. Sam sensed his unease, shadowing him at every step, ears pricked to the faintest sound, body taut with the readiness of a guardian who no longer trusted the peace around them. The swamp itself seemed to brood in sympathy, its waters darker, its fog thicker, as if it too knew that the time for decision could no longer be delayed. Jack had grown used to living on the edge of survival, but he had never been asked to carry a burden of such magnitude. The chest weighed more heavily on him than any debt or failure had before. He could feel it pulling at him, tempting and threatening in equal measure. He caught himself imagining the possibilities, walking into a bank with a few gold coins, watching the teller's face transform from condescension to awe, paying off every debt, buying land that was green and fertile instead of mired in decay. He dreamed of driving a new truck, of living in a house with windows that opened to fields instead of the sagging walls of his trailer. He imagined Sam running free across wide meadows, his fur shining in the sunlight, no longer confined to muddy yards and the gloom of a swamp. But each fantasy ended with a shadow. He would see again the faceless men in the mist, the whispers in town, the mocking laughter that had once seemed harmless, but now carried the bite of suspicion. He imagined the law taking the chest from him under some statute of ownership, leaving him with nothing but the memory of what he had uncovered. He thought of the intruders who had already come, willing to risk everything for a taste of what he had found. And deeper than all of that, he thought of the swamp itself. It had not given up its secret easily, and Jack could not shake the feeling that it had chosen him, not for wealth, but for a test of character. He wrestled with the decision in the quiet hours, sitting at the kitchen table while Sam dozed at his feet. Sometimes he picked up one of the documents, tracing the faded ink with his finger, trying to piece together the story of those who had buried the treasure. He wondered if they too had struggled with the same questions, if they had hidden their wealth not simply from enemies, but from the temptation it carried. Perhaps they had meant to retrieve it, or perhaps they had decided that leaving it buried was safer than letting it corrupt lives. The thought unsettled him, because it mirrored his own turmoil. One evening, as the sun sank low and the swamp glowed red beneath the sky, Jack walked to the water's edge with Sam beside him. He looked across the bog, its surface broken only by the ripple of unseen creatures, and spoke aloud, though there was no one to hear but the dog. "If I take it, everything changes. If I leave it, everything stays the same." Sam barked once, sharp and sudden, as if to break the weight of the words. Jack crouched to rub his ears, feeling the warmth of life in the faithful body that had guarded him without hesitation. But maybe it's not about what changes for me. Maybe it's about what's right. The clarity of that thought startled him. He had spent so long measuring his choices in terms of survival. What would pay the bills? What would keep food on the table? What would stave off humiliation for one more day? But the chest was not a mere lifeline. It was a mirror held up to his soul, forcing him to consider not what he needed, but what he valued. If he pursued the gold recklessly, he would be no different from the shadows that stalked him. If he surrendered it blindly, he risked betraying whatever truth had been buried alongside it. Somewhere between greed and surrender lay a path of honor, but it was narrow, and he did not yet see where it led. That night he dreamed of Uncle Harlan, though he had barely known the man. In the dream, his uncle stood at the edge of the swamp, his figure blurred by fog, and spoke words Jack could not hear. But the expression on his face was stern, almost sorrowful, as if warning Jack that the weight of inheritance was heavier than any man realized when he first accepted it. Jack woke with a start, Sam nudging his hand with a whimper, and the certainty grew within him that the choice ahead was not just about wealth, it was about legacy. The next morning Jack drove into town, the chest still hidden deep within the swamp. He sat in the diner with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring out the window at the faces of people who had once been strangers, but now felt like judges. He imagined what each would do if they knew. Some would beg, some would steal, some would betray. He could not entrust the treasure to them, nor could he entrust it to himself if his motives were not clean. He left the diner without finishing his coffee, Sam trotting close by, and drove back to the swamp with a grim resolve. He spent the afternoon walking the property, thinking not of coins and jewelry, but of what the land represented. It had been dismissed as worthless by everyone, yet beneath its rot and silence, it had hidden a story of endurance. Families had passed it by, neighbors had mocked it, but it had endured, keeping its secret until the day it chose to reveal it. Jack realized he was not so different. He too had been mocked, dismissed, left to rot at the edges of life. And yet he too endured. Perhaps that was why the swamp had offered him its secret, not as a gift to spend, but as a truth to guard. By the time the sun set, Jack had made his decision. He would not sell the chest, nor would he abandon it to thieves or corrupt officials. He would protect it, guard it as faithfully as Sam guarded him. If there was a way to ensure that its value could be used for good, for restoring the swamp, for helping those who suffered as he had, then he would find it. But he would not let greed dictate the outcome. He would choose loyalty, honor, and the steady companionship of the dog who had shown him what true wealth looked like. When he returned to the trailer that night, Sam curled at his feet with a sigh of contentment. Jack felt a peace he had not known since the discovery. The trials were not over. Danger still lurked in the shadows, and the struggle would not be easy. But the choice had been made, and in that choice he found strength. He no longer felt like a man stumbling through life, dragged down by failure. He felt like a man entrusted with something greater, something worth protecting even at the cost of his own comfort. The swamp had tested him, and though the outcome remained uncertain, Jack believed he had answered with the truth of his character. And in that quiet certainty, as the crickets sang outside and the mist drifted once more across the cursed bog, he felt the first stirrings of hope. Hope not for riches, but for redemption. When Jack awoke the morning after his decision, he felt a quiet unlike any he had known in years. It was not the silence of defeat that had haunted his trailer so many nights before, nor the heavy silence of the swamp, brooding and secretive. It was a calm born of clarity, as though the land itself had acknowledged his choice. The air seemed lighter, the mist less oppressive, and even Sam appeared to move with a new energy, trotting ahead on the path with his tail high, pausing now and then to look back at Jack with an almost knowing expression. For the first time since he had unearthed the chest, Jack did not feel hunted by it. He felt bound to it in a way that was less about possession and more about stewardship. The trials that had plagued him did not vanish. There were still eyes in town that lingered too long, still whispers that carried when he entered the diner or the store. But Jack noticed a change in himself. Those whispers no longer unsettled him in the same way. He had accepted that the swamp's treasure was not something to be flaunted or spent recklessly. It was something to be guarded and one day used with purpose. That conviction gave him a strength he had lacked, a way of carrying himself that discouraged some of the bolder attempts to corner him with questions or offers. His neighbors sensed it too, though they could not name it. The man they had once mocked for inheriting a patch of worthless bog seemed less broken now, less small. At night, he and Sam walked the perimeter of the land together, lantern light glimmering against the reeds, the dog's ears flicking at each sound. Jack no longer feared the shadows as he once had. He knew danger would come again. Greed was patient, but he also knew he was no longer the same man who had stumbled into the swamp weeks before. He was steadier, hardened by what he had endured, and guided by the unwavering loyalty of the animal who had never once faltered. Sam had taught him more than he could put into words, that trust was richer than gold, that companionship gave more strength than solitude, and that sometimes the truest treasures were not those hidden in chests but those lying quietly at your feet. The true reward came not in a single moment of triumph, but in the gradual unfolding of days. Jack found work again, steady if modest, and he noticed how even that seemed lighter now. With the knowledge of the treasure, with the conviction of his choice, each dollar earned no longer carried the sting of desperation. He did not feel crushed by poverty in the same way, because deep inside he knew he was not without means, not without hope. The swamp had shown him that life could change in an instant, and that knowledge gave him patience. He could endure, because he had endured. Sam became a figure of legend in Jack's private world, though the town knew nothing of it. The dog had unearthed the secret, had defended it in the night, had stood as Jack's constant companion when loneliness and fear pressed hardest. Jack could not look at him without remembering how close he had come to losing everything, and how Sam had stood between him and ruin more than once. Each morning when the golden retriever bounded into the light, fur glowing as though it carried the sun within it, Jack was reminded that the swamp's gift had come not simply in the form of gold and jewels, but in the revelation of what was already his. Seasons turned. The swamp shifted with them, its reeds growing tall and golden, its waters freezing in thin layers of glass before thawing again into the rich murk of spring. Jack grew to know its moods as he once knew the rhythms of factory machines or city streets. He understood the paths where the ground was safe, the places where mist gathered thickest, the pools that reflected starlight like black mirrors. He and Sam became keepers of that land, silent guardians of its secret, content to live quietly at its edge. There were times when temptation returned. Once, when bills pressed heavily, Jack found himself lifting the chest's lid again, letting the coins spill through his fingers, listening to their metallic chorus. The sound promised ease, freedom, escape. But Sam pressed against him, head nudging his hand, eyes steady and clear. Jack laughed softly, almost bitterly, and closed the chest once more. He realized then that the dog had become his conscience as much as his companion, the living reminder of the path he had chosen. The true lesson revealed itself slowly, like the gradual light of dawn spreading across water. Jack understood at last that the swamp had not been cursed at all. It had been misunderstood, its silence mistaken for emptiness, its murk for worthlessness. Beneath its surface it had carried life, secrets, and history. In that way it was no different from Jack himself, a man others had dismissed, a man who seemed to have nothing left, only to discover that endurance and loyalty could hide treasures greater than gold. The bog had been his mirror, and what he had found within it was not only wealth, but the proof that even the most unlikely lives could hold meaning. One evening, long after the leaves had fallen and the air had grown sharp with frost, Jack sat on the porch with Sam beside him, watching mist curl across the water. The chest remained buried deep within the swamp, hidden where only he and the dog knew. It would stay there until the day came when its use could serve more than his own comfort. Jack no longer worried about when or how that day would arrive. He trusted that when the time was right, the swamp would reveal the path as surely as it had revealed the chest. He reached down to stroke Sam's fur, feeling the warmth beneath his hand, and spoke softly, as though confiding in the only soul who could understand. "We're rich already, you and I, richer than they'll ever know." Sam leaned into him, tail thumping, eyes bright in the fading light. The swamp lay quiet before them, its surface rippling faintly, its secrets safe. And for the first time in as long as Jack could remember, he felt not just peace but gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a lesson in what truly mattered, and he would not squander it. The swamp had tested him with shadows and temptations, had shown him the worst of men's greed and the best of a dog's loyalty. In the end, it had rewarded him not with gold he could spend, but with a life reclaimed, a heart restored, and a companionship that no fortune could equal. As night settled and the stars emerged above the dark waters, Jack knew with unshakable certainty that he had found his treasure long before he ever dug into the bog. It had been walking beside him all along, in the form of a golden retriever who had led him into the depths of the swamp, and more importantly, back into the depths of himself. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out our other videos for more unbelievable stories and share this one with your friends. You never know who else will be shocked by it.